Thank you so much for joining me. I'm Cynthia, and this is the Body, Mind, and Spirit channel. Welcome to part 2 of Life After Death. In this video, I am talking about my own near-death experience. With a diagnosis of stage 3 cancer, the doctors had given me a 50% chance of survival. It was obvious that I was in the death process. For many months, I had experienced and watched my body begin to deteriorate on many levels. I had lost the control of the muscles in my face. It had to begin to move and twist and contort at any given time during the day. My speech was slurred, and I was in a tremendous amount of pain from the tumors. I was told to make my arrangements in case I didn't make it through. And my biggest concern at that time was my disabled mother, who had struggled with a severe neuromuscular disease for the past 40 years of her life. And I had promised her that I would see her through to the end of life, that I would be there for her care, as there was no one else. And I was very disheartened and concerned at the thought of leaving her. I was told that if I made it through the surgery, there was a possibility that I would lose my jaw as well as part of my face, because the surgeons would not be able to tell how far the cancer had spread until they actually opened me up. So far, so good. Nothing was showing up on the scans that indicated the cancer was in the bone, but there was always that chance. So if I came out of this, there was the possibility I would be severely disfigured. My mother and I went to prayer as I prepared for the surgery, which was very common in my household, as I had grown up with prayer. Prayer was a daily part of my life. I always turned everything over to God in any given situation. So it was a natural course of action for my mother and I. She set up an altar and put the names of the 4 surgeons in her special place in the Bible, and had 2 candles on either side of that Bible. And she told me that while I was in the hospital, she would be praying for them and every healthcare practitioner who would be taking care of me. The night before the surgery, I was in prayer, and I said, Lord, I don't know what's coming. I don't know if you're going to take me home with this, 50% chance of survival. They've told me to make my arrangements because my heart may not withstand the surgery. But I said, I would very much like to see my mom through to the end of her life. And I really am not comfortable with the thought of leaving her on her own, as I have no one that I can trust to give her the care she's going to need to have. And I went to bed that night with a lot of peace. I slept deeply. Throughout the worst of the cancer, I had refused painkillers, sedatives, tranquilizers, antidepressants. I knew how to meditate, I knew how to breathe. And that was how I had chosen to get through the pain. And that night, the pain left me. And I had nothing but peace. I found myself drifting through space. And I was greeted by Jesus, who extended his hand outwards to the earth that was spinning in space. And he gave me the message that I would be returning to the earth. There was a reason that I would survive this disease and surgery. The following morning, I was being prepared to go to the OR, and I had requested a hospital chaplain who was Bible-based to administer to me. And at the doorway appeared a man with snow-white hair. He looked exactly how I had always envisioned Merlin in Arthurian legend. His eyes held so much wisdom, and I knew that this man had seen so much. I was instantly drawn to him, and I felt so safe. And he grinned at me, and he said, "What are you in for?" And I told him my tale of woe, all my fears. And I said, "Can you give me my last rites?" I said, "I need to have the extreme unction done," which, if you aren't familiar with the Bible or the extreme unction, that is the 51st Psalm. And this is usually what they do to prisoners who are on death row in the very end, and many others at the end of life. And he said, "Well," he said, "I can do that," but he said, "It's not going to happen. You're going to make it through this surgery because there is something that you haven't finished." And he gave me my last rites and walked with the gurney and the healthcare workers as I was going into the OR. When I arrived at the OR, I had such a sense of peace. It was beyond anything I had ever experienced in my entire life. And as I was going under the anesthesia, my doctors were actually praying. And drifted off. I found myself in a chapel that looked very similar to the chapel in Glastonbury. This chapel has significant meaning to a part of my family history. And once again, I saw Jesus. And he was levitating off of the floor with pure white light all around him. I also saw his mother Mary in white and pink light, levitating. And I began to see roses materialize out of thin air and begin to fall to the ground, where I saw my mother and the hospital chaplain kneeling at the feet of Jesus. And I knew at that point I was indeed going back to earth. It was in divine order. Lots of clarity, lots of deep spiritual healing on every level was taking place. I knew this. I woke up with my mother at my bedside and my doctor, and both of them were holding my hands, and they had been talking to me while I had been in a coma for nearly 2 days. And I remember looking up at the clock and thinking, has that much time passed? In the days that followed, many things took place while I was in intensive care. I began to see the spirits of those who were crossing over in the hospital. They would come, they would stand in my doorway and just look at me. And then I would see a body on a gurney that was covered up, being wheeled out. As time passed, I was ready to make the transition to the surgical floor, where I would spend a month in recovery, adjusting to the fact that I had to live with a tracheotomy and limited mobility. I was connected to an oxygen tank, so I didn't have a lot of freedom to move around. In order to be nourished, I had to have feeding through my nose in a tube that went into my stomach, and both of my hands had IVs, my arms actually, and I had tubing in my head and around my neck. Had a lot of time to think and to work with my mind. And the message I kept getting was to stay calm. That I was experiencing what it would be like for so many people in the final days of their life. I was experiencing a part of the death process, though I had been given a surgery to recover. Shortly after I arrived into the surgical ward, I had trouble breathing. My tracheotomy tube had blocked. It had needed to be cleaned, and I was really struggling. And I began to move my finger to the nurse's call button, and it was the biggest effort I had ever made in my life. And I was trying desperately to reach it because I couldn't breathe. And from there, I found myself trying to swim in water, kind of like a thick substance, almost like water combined with gelatin. This is the only way that I can explain it. And I was trying to claw my way out of it in desperation. And all of a sudden, I found myself in a cemetery. And as I am part Scottish, my relatives showed up in kilts. And I said, have I crossed over? Am I on the other side now? And they looked at me, and everything was done telepathically, so you couldn't see their lips move because we communicate differently when we are on the other side. And they said, no, you are not staying. You are going back. And at that moment, I woke up. And there was doctors and nurses all around me. This is a glimpse of the other side. A glimpse to me of what is to come at one point in my life. I am so blessed to share this message with you. I share it in love, with wishes of well-being and enlightenment. I look forward to spending time with you in part 3 of this series.